Friends, ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure that you are all here. And the way many of these things work, it takes the first 5 minutes for people to walk in from other rooms. So to do justice to the people who have come in time, let's start in time. And we'll try and accommodate others as they come along. My name is Rahman. I'm Executive Director of Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies and for these purposes, Chairman of the Climate Action Network South Asia. Today, this morning here for 90 minutes, we are together in this room and we will be all hopefully talking about loss and damage due to climate change, trying to understand the values, vulnerability, and livelihood security. Many of you might know that loss and damage is a latecomer and newcomer in the climate game. And in these corridors where some decisions are made, some decisions are pretended to be made, some decisions are kept high in the air, and many decisions one does not dare talk about. So this is a very interesting area where we are. The main climate negotiation that is going on. This conference of the party, some people have said this is the loss and damage conference of the party. If Paris agreement had a different version, loss and damage would be far more in the middle of everything. However, for those who have studied the Paris Agreement, it has two documents. The first, 21 pages is how to make decisions or decision-making processes, and the Paris Agreement itself is a 12-page document. And the usual analogy I give it to friends and politicians across the world in trying to explain what is it like, there are two sort of models or analogies that work. One is a fisherman's net, where there are knots and things are held by those knots, and everything is empty in between. So it's up to us, the negotiators, participants, all of us to fill those boxes. The other model is a model of jigsaw puzzle, where we have different pieces get together, then you have to fit them in, and each puzzle has to stand on its own, then you fit them in and make a steady picture or the whole complete the system. In any of those models, we are in the early days of Paris Conference implementation, to say the least. So I would call this conference of party the implementation conference, while the last one in Paris was the agreement conference. And in doing implementation, what was already assigned for this was a working group and a work program on loss and damage. So that is being discussed all around. I, for one, believe that climate change, in the early days, those who have been involved, it was meant to be mitigation as the central issue. So mitigation first was the issue. Unfortunately, the world, countries, leaders, parties were doing more parties than really attending to climate negotiation and mitigation. So it's the failure of mitigation that has given rise to the demand and activities of adaptation, because what we have not mitigated creates enormous amount of impacts which have to be adapted by, and very often these are being adapted by people, communities across the world who neither have the means, some knowledge, but mostly it has been gut feeling through which many of these adaptations were being done. Things are moved a lot further now, and we are in the adaptation mode. We have learned quite a lot about adaptation in the last 20 or so years. It is when adaptation will fail, loss and damage is the subsequent implications, which means that we have not been able to adequate adaptation to address the challenges that mostly comes from the extreme events, extreme weather events coming out of climate change, where there are cyclones or floods, wildfires, droughts across the world. And this is, one has to be able to say that this has a link with climate change. If it is not linked, then it's a debate that goes elsewhere. There are human rights, there are disaster management issues. And in the last 2015 has been a unique year of convergence for this planetary decision-making system, because there was the Sendai Agreement on climate disaster risk reduction or disaster risk reduction framework, which the appeal was to integrate climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Then we had the famous agreement on sustainable development goals, 17 goals, all countries agreed. And the rare occasion in this December was the agreement on Paris Conference on climate change, and climate change happens to be number 13 in the SDG list. So SDG was already there. They held the position for climate change in number 13, and then Paris Agreement brought down and filled that gap, and all that is going on in quite a gusto in some places. The whole issue of finance and others remain. So here, what we'll be doing today is a discussion on loss and damage, where it is, where we are, how things are happening, particularly a sort of view from bottom up, really, trying to see how things are happening. At the same time, we'll be talking about policy and policy formulation. And there are tangible and intangible ways of loss and damage evaluation. Many of you may know that the Paris Conference had identified a mechanism by which the countries, so-called countries responsible, the common but differentiated responsible and respective capabilities, that terminology has not really appeared in the same strength in Paris Conference, which is a negation of the Climate Convention. Nonetheless, loss and damage has come in, but there has been words like no attribution or no accountability. Well, that is a world that we can talk a bit later more. Here, I'm very pleased to have a number of distinguished practitioners, top-level scientists, policymakers amongst us to discuss, and that includes all of you too. So I have Professor Petra Tschakert, and if I'm supposed to make that T very strong, but anyway, she will be talking about place-based understanding of loss, what people value and what they deem as worth protecting. She's at the University in Perth, leading a lot of activities. She is integrally involved in the IPCC International Panel of Climate Change. Then we have Mr. Ghulam Rabbani. He will be talking about non-economic and economic loss and damage, a case study of Bangladesh. He is from the Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies, has been working across the world on many of these issues. His specialty is water, climate change, sustainable development. Dr. Naomi Joy Gordon, she is at the Monash University in Australia, and she will be talking about understanding intersecting dimension of inequality in non-economic loss and damage. So inequality, gender perspective. Then we have Mr. Mamunur Rashid from United Nations Development Program, where he has been involved in the Planning Commission earlier in developing some of the early initiatives and basically looking at how social protection of the poor communities vis-a-vis loss and damage work. Ms. Felicitas Montana and Harriet Thew, they're from the University of Leeds, UK, and they're going to talk about what does loss and damage mean to youth and informal settlements in Cape Town of South Africa. So that's a African perspective. Dr. Salimul Haq was supposed to be here. He has handed over the responsibility to me to speak for him. We are very good friends, and been working together, so he has another meeting and another activity, but he may not drop in. Mr. Ashraf Amin, who is from the World Food Program, will replace him in the podium. Is Ashraf here? Yeah. So, over to Petra.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Wonderful. My name is Petra, and I really want to share with you an approach that we think is complementary to what we have so far on loss and damage, which is predominantly climate projections, risk assessments, and then some kind of evaluation, predominantly monetary, of residual loss. Our approach is different. It looks at what people value and deem protecting. To get us started here, I will please ask you just for a moment to put aside your laptop and your cell phone, close your eyes, imagine where your home is, imagine what your major experienced or in the future to be experienced climate threat is, and then imagine what you value most in your life and what you will try to defend against all odds in the context of climate change. Just close your eyes and try to imagine that. Okay, so hold on to that thought while we go through this presentation, and we'll see if that makes sense to you at the end. So we really want to understand what people value and what is at risk. I have a particular problem if we equate what we used to call impacts 5 to 10 years ago now with loss and damage. Not every impact is loss. And yes, many impacts will lead to damages, but not necessarily loss in the way the UNFCCC defines it, which is irreversible harm. And even if there is loss, we ought to be careful because certainly not every loss matters or matters equally. So our research approach tries to be a little bit more sophisticated in determining what could be a loss, to whom, and why. If we look at two definitions that come out of the IPCC and other reports that may be different from what you're used to, you will better understand why values are important. So the first definition is adaptation. You all have your own definitions of adaptation, but here's one that I think is very useful for loss and damage. Adaptation, we can say, are attempts to keep risks to valued objectives and objects at a tolerable level in the face of climate change. Right? That's adaptation. Limits to adaptation are then the points at which adaptation fails to protect things that stakeholders value. So it is really about values. That graphic to the right, some of you may be familiar with, looks at risks in the context of intensity of impacts, x-axis, and frequency of impacts. And there's a differentiation, if you want, between what is acceptable risk, what is tolerable, and what is intolerable risk. And we're predominantly concerned, of course, with those up here because these intolerable risks could also become intolerable losses. In the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism Loss and Damage, there's one action area, it's action area 4, that deals with what is known as non-economic losses. We can talk about whether that word is the best one. We can call it non-market losses. We can call it intangible or invisible losses. We can differentiate if they're intrinsic or instrumental. That's not the point. The point here is we're concerned about these intangible losses, and we really want to understand from a research perspective how we can better identify them, address them, and then potentially deal with them at the policy level. There are various ways to look at values that underpin these intangible, invisible losses. If you're an economist, you will take an economic lens. There's a philosophical, a psychological, an ecological lens. Our lens, I'm a geographer, is a human geography lens. Why? Because many of the adaptation studies that lend themselves to extract information on loss and damage use that particular lens. It looks at lived values, lived experiences, embodied experiences on the ground. And it calls for situated and engaged research. So situated and engaged research, we have to be on the ground. We cannot possibly detect that through GCMs. I'm going to show you an example to get across what I mean here. This is Marshall Islands, eBay Island. And it may not look like the Pacific island we all have in mind with wonderful sandy beaches and palm trees, but this is reality already today for people who live there. Maybe several of the atolls or the Pacific Islands will look like this in the context of climate change in the future, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 50 years. And you may not like that picture, and maybe you don't want to live there. But who are we to judge what a livable place is? If this is livable to people, they should put everything they have to defend this place if it's valuable to them, right? So who are we to judge what a livable place is? Loss, we argue, is a matter of what people value and deem worth protecting. If it is this, then that's exactly what they should do. Loss is given meaning through experiences on the ground, rooted in place, what place and place attachment and place identity means to people. It's more felt than tangible, and it's really difficult to measure and model. And losses that are intangible, invisible, you will see examples, certainly cannot easily be compensated with insurance mechanisms that are targeted towards market mechanisms. I'll give you 2 examples of what such research looks like. Before that, however, I want to point out that if you haven't seen it yet, we just have a publication out called A Science of Loss that looks at well-being, place, health, and identity. And these are the factors we're really interested in. 2 examples. Narratives of endurance. First one comes from Australia. How can we make everyday experiences visible? How can we extract the risk level people are willing to live with today and potentially in the future? So you may say, Australia, well, that's not even a developing country. Well, sure enough, loss is experienced everywhere on the planet. The example here is the Millennium Drought. So we're looking at farmers who engage in these narratives of endurance, who live them. And their experiences with drought are not necessarily limited to loss of livestock and loss of crop. What really hits them eventually, in this case, is when drought, the lack of rain, impacts the social fabric in a community. The tipping points are when the social fabric falls apart. In this case, when people could no longer play sports. It's not the harvest, it's not the cattle, it's when they could no longer play sports, because that's what keeps the community together. And nonetheless, people endure, engage, are gearing up to hang on, because that's what is called the Aussie mentality. As a farmer, you ought to be tough, you ought to endure. However, we've also seen in the case of Australia examples of increased suicide rates, because it's expected that especially the male farmers are tough, are stoic, suck it up. And the consequences that we have seen increasing cases of isolation and suicide. Under that paradigm, you ought to be tough and endure. My own work in Ghana has shown narrowing of identities. When people, also failing farmers, lose more and more of their multiple identities and are only and nothing else than failing farmers. Here, the breaking point was not sports. The breaking point was when people lost their dignity due to the fact that they had to share the same water source with animals. These are critical thresholds we want to pay attention to. Now, let me lead you through a framework that we are proposing to deal with these and address these intangible losses. And we call it a relational framing of loss. And the relationship is between a climate stressor and a potential loss. And let's start with what people may value in a certain place, and maybe some of those you have mentioned in your mind to yourself. Let's arrange them along a horizontal line, what people value a little bit more and maybe a little bit less. It's not that they don't value, in this case, health, but they value most identity and farming. Let's add climate as a stressor, and here we can see how people prioritize what they value. And we want to understand what we do with when there are more than one thing that people value, and when damages and losses occur sequentially. And so what you can see is these are the ones we're worried about, because these are in the intolerable space. Of course, people will try to adapt, and the yellow arrows show potential for adaptation. But on the scarce resources, people will make trade-offs and put their adaptation efforts into things they value most. And you will put it in whatever you imagine, in this case, farming and identity. They will not invest in health because it's just not that important. And people make choices, trade-offs, often with suboptimal options in their hands. These are unfortunate trade-offs. They're not desirable, but this is what happens. So maybe what we should do is to pay attention to social tipping points, to unacceptable impacts, to acceptable impacts, and areas where people feel they're willing to let go of what is just not that important in their lives. We're fooling ourselves if we think we can conserve and preserve everything. And maybe some avoided impacts can be shifted, or maybe some avoided impacts are those that can be shifted from a looming loss to an acceptable or tolerable damage. We need to be forward-looking. We have to understand what people will do in the future, how their values are going to shift. We can think about anticipatory histories, embracing loss now in areas that are simply unavoidable. Here are options for Australian farmers, for people in Pacific Islands. Not going to go into those. These options are real, they exist today, they will exist in the future. Not one single option is without cost. They all involve potential losses, but they differ, and it depends on the choices people make. So, last slide here. If you have case studies on intangible, invisible losses in your area, sector, region, send them to us. We're collecting them to make a comparative analysis that tries to get as many invisible, intangible loss and damage cases as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra, for setting the scene for what we're going to discuss. Now, I would request Ghulam Rabbani to speak on the economic and non-economic laws. Encouraged to finish within 7 minutes. I must not cross 10 minutes. That's the, yeah. Let's try and stick to that, because we really want to bring in your time, the more audience can participate. So that's the name of the game. Over to Ghulam Rabbani.
Thank you, Rahman, chair of this session, my fellow colleagues and distinguished participants. Following Professor Petra's presentation, let me just take you to the field where we brought the evidences how the people, the poor farmers and the poor communities are facing the loss and non-economic loss and damages. So I'll share with you two major case studies that we conducted in the southwest coast of Bangladesh. And these two studies were supported by United Nations University and Asian Development Bank. And I will share some of the key observations that we have found in these two case studies. And the case study number one, we tried to explore the relationship between the salinity intrusion in the surface water and the soil, and what happens to the rice production in the agricultural field. So the study was conducted in this Tschakert, which is southwest coastal district, exposed to very vulnerable area and salinity intrusion, cyclone storm surge, sea level rise, and other climate-induced hazards. So this is the area that we conducted this study, and it was Union Parishad, which is two administrative units, lowest administrative unit in the country. And the key findings that we see is, different type of climate-induced hazards that affect the people in this particular area. We start from the increased temperature, salinity in the agricultural field, as I mentioned, shifting of rainfall, lack of rainfall, excessive rainfall, cyclone, drought, and waterlogging. These are the major climate-induced hazards that actually affect the people and their livelihoods. And what happens at the end when we calculated the economic losses and damages, it shows the cyclone Ayla, when it hit the coastal communities on 25th of May in 2009, many of the farmers could not really cultivate the rice in 2009, 2010, and 2011. So 3 consecutive years, they faced the loss of rice cultivation there. And these findings were published by International Global Warming Journal. So you can see what happened these 4 villages. The total amount they lost is 1.9 million US$. And in this particular district, they have 1,436 villages, and we have 64 districts. 19 of this total 64 districts are the coastal district. So what happens when cyclone affect the areas and the farmers cannot cultivate in the rices for several consecutive years? And let me take you to the case study 2, which is actually non-economic losses and damages from slow and sudden onset events in southwest Bangladesh. If you look at different type of sudden onset events and slow onset events, it affects actually 3 levels: at the individual level, at the societal level, and at the environment level. Individual level, for example, Cyclone Ayla and Cyclone Cedar in Bangladesh, when affected in 2007 and 2009 consecutively, many of the children in the affected upajilas or affected areas could not go to the school for 6 months to even 1 year. So this is something that you cannot really interpret with the economic terms, and this is the non-economic losses and damages that they have to bear for the entire life. So how do you really address? So can you really ignore this loss and damages in the global climate change negotiation? So this cannot be avoided in the global climate negotiation. If you ignore this, and then what happens is you are actually non-complying the climate convention, especially the Article 4.1e, Article 4.3, Article 4.4. So at the societal level, if you see, our observation is the traditional culture and the local culture, local festivals, these have been affected severely, because if they do not have sustainable livelihood options and they suffer from the livelihood crisis, they cannot really have their festivals going on, seasonal festivals, and the annual festivals. So that is one of the things that is disappearing from the local communities, all the affected communities. And the environment level, if you look at the river, different type of rivers, different rivers in the country, and the canals, the lakes, the salinity is affecting the ecosystems. So what happens? The different species are being endangered and even extinct to some extent. So people are complaining because of increased salinity intrusion and the surface water temperature. Some of the surface water species are not available anymore in the last 10 years. So this is how we see at the individual level, at the societal level, at the environment level, ecosystems level, people are suffering and the ecosystems are suffering, which is the non-economic type of loss and damage that we see. This is what is a bit more details that you see, the death, injuries, and the psychological disorders that that affect because of these climate-induced hazards are really affecting the local communities, and education, societal level, and environment level. But let me take you to what is happening on the ground. People are not sitting idle. People are doing something. The organizations are doing something. So I will call Mr. Ashraful Amin, who is working on addressing loss and damage, and he will share a case, just one small case, how things are happening. People are not sitting idle, as I mentioned. Mr. Ashraf.
Thanks, Mr. Rabbani. In next 2-3 minutes, I'll just talk about one of our research works on addressing loss and damage. WFP Bangladesh Country Office, in association with the Government of Bangladesh, implemented a countrywide enhancing resilience program to reduce the loss and damage resulting from climate change, different climate-related shocks and stresses. The program beneficiaries, as you can see on the left side, the program beneficiaries took part in community work, especially art work and training in exchange for cash and food. And the research that we commissioned as part of our global program, research program, mainly looked into whether the participants of this enhancing resilience program are better able to deal with climate-related shocks, stressors like cyclone, flooding, as well as some idiosyncratic shocks, which are eventually, in most cases, are the outcomes of the climate-related shocks like death of livestock, injury, all these. The research result shows that the program beneficiaries are less likely to engage in negative coping strategies than the non-beneficiaries. The table to the right side shows that the enhancing resilience program reduces the probabilities of the program beneficiaries to engage in different negative coping strategies like reducing family expenses, taking loans to survive, by 5 to 16%, depending on different shock response combination that you see in the table. On the horizontal side, you can see the negative strategies, and vertically, you can see the stresses and shocks. The results also show that the ER participants are more resilient compared to the non-beneficiaries. For example, they reported faster recovery rates after being affected by a climate-related shock like cyclone. So on top of these, we are also doing some follow-up studies to look into how our programs are reducing the loss and damage and enhancing the resilience of community people using some innovative approach. You can have a copy of this infographic or the poster and an executive summary of the study to the right side of the podium. Once our program is over, you can take a copy. And thanks for your patience hearing.
Thank you, Ashraf. That's a specific case study, which is very useful. Now I'm requesting Dr. Naomi Joy Gordon from Monash University to present her case of understanding the intersection dimension of inequality in economic, non-economic law.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So I'm going to introduce the concept of intersectionality today, which is a lens that helps us to understand the multiple and intersecting forms of inequality that result in diverse experiences of loss and damage. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Not enough?
Sorry, we're just waiting for that slide. I'll just talk it through.
Should be able, do we need experts or do we need?
Okay, so
All right.
intersectionality tells us that there are multiple and different
Yeah.
types of inequality
it.
that we need
No?
to analyze when
Let's
examining
take one by one.
people's experiences. So these might be involving aspects such as gender, age, income level, ability, geographic location, sexuality, religion, and so on. When we look at loss and damage, an intersectional lens shows us that people experiencing the
Not
same
projecting
climate
there,
threat
though.
in the same place may have different experiences of loss,
Somebody who knows this
depending on
better.
their social that they belong to or the categories that they belong to. When we use an intersectional lens, here we go. When we use an intersectional lens, it means that we can avoid generalizations and we can honor the diversity of people's experiences. And further to that, we can contextualize human rights issues for marginalized people. Thank you. All right. One really important aspect of applying an intersectional lens is that, as well as understanding these differentiated experiences, we also understand the underlying power structures that inform these inequalities, like systems of patriarchy, homophobia, racism, and so on. And then thinking about how climate policy and action may reinforce or challenge these power structures. So I'm going to illustrate how to apply an intersectional lens when considering loss and damage with 3 different case studies. The first case study is a community called Lebitos, located in northern Peru, and this is based on my personal research. This is a small fishing village that experiences multiple forms of climate impacts, such as declining fisheries due to changing sea temperatures and extreme floods from intensified El Nino events. In 1998, this community experienced an extreme flood, which resulted in the loss of homes, lives, and fishing boats. At the same time, a lot of sand was pushed into this beach, creating a quite incredible surfing wave, which has now turned the community into an internationally renowned surfing destination. Some people in the community have been able to transition from the fisheries livelihood into this alternative livelihood space of surf tourism. However, in this process, we have seen some non-market loss and damages. The first is around livelihoods. So particularly older fisherfolk in the community have a very strong value placed on their livelihood and their fishing culture and their relationship to the ocean. As the fisheries have declined, some of these older community members, particularly fishermen, lament the loss of fishing as a livelihood and the associated identity that they have to that. At the same time, we're also seeing that low-income people engaged in fisheries who are no longer able to fish as much also lament this loss because they don't have a viable alternative livelihood. However, some young men who are participating in the surf tourism industry don't see this as such a major loss because they have an alternative livelihood and an alternative identity and culture that they're relating to. Community members in this town also have a very strong sense of value placed on the natural beauty of this community and their access to the beach, which is such a big part of their identity. Again, older fisherfolk in this community are lamenting the loss of free access to the beach because with the introduction of surf tourism, we are seeing many hotels constructed around the beach, making it difficult for community members to enjoy their own beach. Peace and tranquility is also a very important value in this community. And older women, particularly in this town, are concerned that this is changing with the introduction of tourists, with introduction of new ideas and concerns around increased drugs and crime in the community. In comparison, young men in the community are concerned about the potential of a loss of local identity as young people in their surfing culture with the introduction of international tourists and surfers. The second case study is rural Australia. As Petra alluded to earlier, we've had a significant drought in Australia called the Millennium Drought between 1996 and 2010. Now, this drought affected a lot of southern Australia, particularly affecting agricultural production and well-being in rural communities. When we apply an intersectional lens in analysing different forms of loss and damage, some interesting findings emerge. This work is based on, what I'm speaking about today is based on Professor Margaret Alston's work from Australia. During the drought, we saw significant losses around mental health and well-being, particularly for farming men. There was a lot of reports of depression and suicide. Now, farming women also experienced health impacts, but these were not valued as highly by rural communities as men's health. We also have differentiated experiences of loss and damage around landscape. Men that had an intergenerational attachment to land lamented the loss and grieved the loss of landscape and the identity that they associated with that. In comparison, women who married into the farming communities didn't have such a strong attachment to land, but they grieved the loss of the gardens that they had built themselves around the homes. Other research also shows that older Indigenous women have a different sense of loss around land because of their spiritual relationship with land. Power is also an important aspect to consider. The drought made farming livelihoods unviable, and so many women commenced working off-farm. Now, one of the key losses here was loss of time. Women were involved in off-farm work, on-farm work, and domestic labour work, so a triple burden. At the same time, some men experienced a loss of their masculinized identity, and some engaged in more violence against women to try and entrench their own patriarchal power. So here we have a loss of safety for the women. Finally, research also shows that some children and young people had experienced a loss of access to education because of decreased finances from the family. And finally, the third case study is New Orleans in the United States. This is a city of 350,000 people situated on the Mississippi Delta. And in 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, resulting in about 80% of the city being underwater. Now, research by Professor Nancy Tuana from Penn State University shows that the people who were most affected by this hurricane were those who already experienced structural inequalities. So low-income people, people of colour, LGBTI people, and other marginalised groups. New Orleans residents have a very strong and a unique sense of place. based on their cultural aspects like food, art, and music, the New Orleans Jazz Festival, the Mardi Gras, and other important cultural events. This is related to housing and home and a sense of home, which is, obviously a big part of the sense of place. Now, Katrina's destruction had a big impact and lost many, many homes and displaced whole neighbourhoods, which also has an impact on loss of identities, communities, and memories associated with place. Now, the research shows that it was people of colour, poor people of colour, who were particularly impacted by the loss of social housing, and LGBTI people who lost their homes and their neighbourhoods experienced what's called queer domicide, so the unmaking of their safe homes and neighbourhoods through this experience. Another clear sense of loss was around safety and security. And again, while this was widespread around New Orleans, the research shows that there was increased violence, particularly against Black women, and increased discrimination for LGBTI women and people of colour. There were also disproportionate deaths of elderly and disabled women due to Hurricane Katrina. So the key message from these 3 case studies is that loss and damage varies in places, but it also varies between people depending on their intersecting experiences of inequality and the social categories that they belong to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the lesson from that few short case studies is it's not a rich country or a poor country issue. It's an issue of society. It's an issue of people being impacted. Normally, the poor and the vulnerable are most affected, but it cuts across the countries as a whole. May I now oh no, sorry, beg your pardon, I'm making a mistake. Mamunur Rashid from UNDP Dhaka to Bangladesh to give a presentation on critical transformation. Mamun, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to present a case study of same area that my Bangladeshi colleague has presented. And this case study is based on the lessons that UNDP and a local non-governmental organizations collected for the last 7 years from their different activities in the area. So during Ayla is a cyclone which happened in 2009. In these 2 districts, there is a huge devastation. And particularly, it is important to note that these 2 districts are located in very close catchment of the Sundarban mangrove forest, which is the largest mangrove in the world. And it's a UNESCO heritage site. And this area is unique in terms of it's a Ganges tidal floodplain. It has a brackish water ecosystem, highly sensitive to climate change, but it was also a very rich source of the biodiversity in that specific part of the country. We studied to the different unions of this area. We try to identify the landscape, soil quality, the way people are interacting to the east interaction area. We try to identify their community assets as well as their individual household assets, and we try to find out their adaptation limit and whether they, after the 2009, since 2016, how they are really coping up and where they are really failing to cope up, which can be qualified as a potential loss and damage. So what we find from the study is that there are this ecosystem, particularly the natural and the human ecosystem of the particular area, is highly at risk due to the increased salinity, sea level rise, and higher sediment deposition in the rivers. And the adaptation limit of this ecosystem, particularly to provide fresh water, this was once upon a time a brackish water, now completely saline. And the types of livelihood that the people were carrying out, you can see that the way people are doing their livelihood is really now under stress, and people are not able to continue the same types of livelihood in that area. So in a nutshell, the findings is that since 2007, each alternate year, actually, the area is exposed to the different types of climate events, particularly either tidal flooding or sea level rise. And what we found that most of the poor people of that area, for example, the households who has less than $2 per day income, 97% of those sorts of households are recurrently affected by the disaster that is happening in that area. And the main adaptation strategies that we find out, or I want to say the maladaptation of the coping, is that there is a huge displacement from that area because people cannot even return to their home after 3 years of the incidents. So many of them, mostly the poor quartile now, migrated or displaced to some of the nearby cities. And the statistics of those cities shows that there are 20% increase of the urban poor in the nearby cities. And these are not the poor of the urban inhabitants become more poorer, rather the rural poor has displaced to the urban poor. So rural poverty reduces, but the urban poverty increases. That's a very interesting findings. We find out that the most of the rural poor are migrating to the urban areas, and they are selling the land. One of the maladaptive strategies they have taken, that they are forced to sell their land because the land could not produce the same types of livelihood. And interestingly, the land they were owning, they have to sell it in the half price because the land, when the land productivity decline, they have to sell it in a much compromised price just to sustain their minimum well-being and livelihood. And there is also some of the other maladaptation. What we found that they have increased their neighboring borrowing from the microcredit organization as well as the relatives. And there is an illegal resource extraction from the Sundarban also increased by some of the poor people. And early marriages also increased in the particular area because they are not in a position to afford education, health, and the other safety and security of the adolescents, girls particularly. And there is a huge dependency on the government relief program. And the estimation was that around 0.3% loss of the GDP was only happened in that particular event in 2009. So the summary of the lessons here is that I think the ecosystem, particularly the natural and the cultural, both has crossed the limits to adopt, particularly in that area. For example, one of the I think sign of this example is that government is now spending, already in the last 7 years, they have spent $300 million only from the social safety net to protect these people. So this is a huge expenditure government has to spend just to sustain the people and their basic, very, very minimum needs. And loss of the freshwater species is, I think, disappeared. And 100% of the freshwater drinking sources are lost. So there is no single freshwater drinking water source is sustaining. So it also increases the unpaid domestic labor of the women to collect water from afar. So on an average, 2 hours travel time of the women has increased per day. And that has also made them, I think, shift from the productive hour to the unpaid domestic work. So the particular area I'm talking about, in the last 7 years, there were 3 major cyclonic events, as well as in each 15 days, these areas are flooded by the tidal flooding. So the resilience to the unlimited shock is nearly impossible for these people. There is a high risk of the negative human development growth, particularly education, health, and other things. Cost of inaction is also higher, and social protection expenditure needs to be more expanded and be transformed so that the benefit for these people is in terms of poverty reduction, gender inequality, and adaptation comes together, so they can somehow come back to the adaptation limit. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that definitely local people are already experiencing the losses, and in these fragile ecosystems, most of the people and their ecosystem has crossed the limits of the adaptation. And there is a danger of the maladaptation, which is very evident in that area. And if that continues, then the adaptive capacity will be highly limited. And we need to approach this from the various forms of existing inequalities, because the climate shocks and the loss and damage is also affecting the existing socio-economic infrastructure. So it is deepening the gender inequality and income inequality in the area. And the spectrum of the losses that we find out is a tangible and intangible both, and it is interacting each other, economic. And many of the losses now, but the cumulative spillover of the impact of the losses in future as well. And there are national mechanisms, but very inadequate. And these important issues need to be embedded within the development paradigm, not only in the emergency response mechanism. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one is long-term studies are helpful, then you can follow up. The second is, of course, it is integral part of development. You just cannot have isolation. An isolated development. Now it's my pleasure to call upon Felix Montana and Harriet Thew to present their case of South Africa, Cape Town, South Africa. Over to you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, I'll just lift that up a bit. I'm Harriet Thew from the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds. I'm researching youth participation in climate governance, and I also teach on our master's programs in environment and development and climate change and environmental policy. I've also advocated within this process, the UNFCCC, for several years for youth participation, and I like to practice what I preach, so I brought with us Felicitas Montana, or Thuli, one of our recent graduates from South Africa. We're the University of Leeds is part of the World Universities Network research group looking at non-economic loss and damage. So Thuli did her master's dissertation research in Cape Town in informal settlements with a focus on young people. We decided to focus on youth as an understudied group on the basis of previous research, which indicates that different age groups experience climate change impacts differently and therefore are likely to have different losses and damages. I co-supervised Thuli's dissertation with Dr. Susanna Sallu from the University of Leeds, who specialises in adaptation and livelihoods, and also with support from Dr. Gina Ziervogel at the University of Cape Town, who provided insights on flooding in informal settlements. So I'll now hand over to Thuli to tell you all about her work.
Thank you very much for that, Harriet, and a good afternoon to you all. I'll start by giving a brief outline of my study. So the focus of my study was on informal settlements in Cape Town. Cape Town has approximately 400 informal settlements, and these are located on the outskirts of the city. These settlements are highly populated by young Xhosa-speaking Black Africans who have migrated from rural areas of the Eastern Cape in search for employment. These settlements were designated residential areas for Black Africans during the apartheid era, and they were centralized on marginalization and inequality. To this day, these settlements face complex socio-economic issues, which are exacerbated by climate change, as I will touch on. Due to the large number of migrants, some areas are not yet recognized as legal dwellings, and thus they may be neglected in adaptation efforts. I picked Philippi and Kailicha as the settlements that I focused on, and this is because they are two of the largest settlements in Cape Town. Both these settlements are vulnerable to extreme weather, and literature states that they are flood prone and will experience annual floods, which are projected to increase in the near future. I thus focused on flooding as a climatic event for the study. Both settlements are part of the Cape Flats region, which is low-lying, marginal land comprised of wetlands and dunes. So now that I've given a bit of context on the background, I'll now focus on the youth focus for the study. There's a mandate in Agenda 21 for the inclusion of youth in decision-making processes. And the African Youth Charter states that youth are a fundamental resource for the development of the continent. So regardless of these two statements, youth remain understudied, overlooked, and underrepresented in decision-making at all levels, particularly within the informal settlements. I interviewed youth ages 17 to 35, and these young people, which form a large part of the Western Cape population, expressed that no one is listening to them and their needs aren't being met. Youth in these settlements suffer from high unemployment, as well as issues associated with crime and drug use. The aim of my study was to explore youth experiences of flooding and further test the applicability of loss and damage categories which have been established through academic literature. So I wanted to see how these categories would fit into this particular context. I also wanted to identify what occurs beyond these categories that is specific to what youth value and classify as loss and damage. I did a gender-based, I did qualitative interviews which are gender-based because we know from the literature, and as Naomi has touched on, that people of different genders experience climate change in varying ways and have different needs, values, and priorities which have to be taken into account. The first finding is that youth in these settlements experience impacts from flooding, but are not connecting it with a bigger picture of climate change. The second finding was that youth experience loss and damage in ways that are unique to their generation. I found that youth are experiencing loss and damage that reflects physical, psychological, and social impacts. You'll see that I've included quotes on my slides to bring the voices of these young people to the COP, as many of them are not able to participate in events like this. So I'll start with the physical impacts. So yeah, physical impacts include the loss and damage of homes, health, infrastructure, and connected to that is mobility. Other studies have found that non-youth are experiencing loss and damage to these things too, but the values with which youth attribute to these things are slightly different. Housing is central in the transition from youth to adulthood. Youth mentioned that, Housing is central in the transition from youth to adulthood, which youth research highlights as being central to their identity. So the desire for independence places youth at increased risk, often compelling them to accept the poorest quality housing in the least developed areas of the settlements, which are likely flood prone. So youth place themselves in high risk areas to fulfill their desire for independence. Just to add on, so the condition of the housing and infrastructure varies across these settlements. So new youth arriving from the Eastern Cape will be building their homes in less desirable land, which I've mentioned as being commonly flood prone. These young people take what they can get, which are often homes which no one else wants, or they have to build their homes on land which has already been occupied. So yeah, a young person's house is not just their home, it's their identity, their autonomy, their independence, and let's face it, their street cred. The damage to infrastructure and mobility led to the loss of educational attainment, which in turn leads to the loss of livelihood prospects. In South Africa, if you don't get your high school certificate, it's hard to even find a basic job. So many of these young people express the difficulty of getting to school during times of heavy rainfall. Psychological forms of loss and damage include worry, hopelessness, anger, and resignation. Excuse me. Youth accept the damages they experience from flooding as just another part of their difficult lived realities, causing loss of youthful optimism and damage to their aspirations and long-term, and this in effect has long-term consequences. If you believe that, and as the African Youth Charter suggests, and as we've heard in high-level events here, that the energy and passion of youth is integral to sustainable development and climate action, this becomes a critical issue for governments as the collective consequence of these experiences takes on significance beyond the individual level. Social impacts include the damage to community cohesion, excuse me, as when climate change exacerbates the difficulties faced by already vulnerable and marginalized groups who in the South African context already attribute this marginalization to their race, tensions inevitably increase. And just to add on this as well, so as youth experience more damage from flooding, they lose their ability to support one another as their focus turns to their own coping strategies. So lack of perceived support also erodes their willingness to support each other. This was predominantly expressed amongst young males. Young females had a different experience. The people in the settlements most likely to have their health damaged are children. This has implications for children's rights and also particularly for their mothers, often young single women who shoulder the burden of care. This diagram here encapsulates everything that I've spoken about, and these are the areas that emerged from my research that appear to be unique to youth in contrast to non-youth focused studies. I won't go into detail with each of these, but if you follow Harriet and I on Twitter, I will share the link throughout the day, and you can also come and talk to us after the event. To conclude, youth are experiencing losses and damages which are unique to their generation. Power dynamics related to their age, gender, class intersect to increase their susceptibility to climate-related losses and damages. And lastly, the repairable damages they currently experience are likely to become permanent losses if they are not addressed urgently. I'll now hand over to Harriet, who has played a vital role in helping me translate my findings into the policy sphere based on her research and expertise in youth participation and her engagement in the UNFCCC. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you very much. We have done reasonably. Oh,
Sorry, 1 second.
You've got to.
Yeah, so we just wanted
Keep it
to
short.
highlight a couple of recommendations based on Thule's findings. The main thing that was really specific to youth is that if their mobility is damaged during those critical years when they're trying to get to school, that's a permanent loss of education. Then they don't get that high school certificate, the matric, and then it's a loss of livelihood prospects. That's something that's unique to the youth generation. So we want policy responses to consider non-economic losses and damages and to be guided by empirical studies such as this one with the focus on vulnerable, hard-to-reach groups and particularly youth. We believe that these studies should incorporate age and gender disaggregated data to ensure that different groups are being taken into account and evaluation of different policies and making sure that these solutions are working for everybody in the community. And we also believe that mainstreaming of Article 6 of the Convention, the UNFCCC Convention, also linked to Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, is necessary to raise awareness of climate change more broadly so that people have adaptive capacity is increased as well, and it can lead to more autonomous adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've done reasonably well with time. We are a bit short. What I will do now is, you've heard different perspectives. I'll go back to the audience for your participation. What I would appreciate is a focused question or comment. And please do mention your name and affiliation, just minimum words. And then we hope once we can take in the audience participation, we will have 1 to 1.5 minutes at the end to each of our panel on this side. And if time permits, I'll take about 3 minutes to sum up. Yes, please, John, you start. Then I'll come back to you, ma'am. Waldemar, can you please, can somebody be on the other side to help time as well? I need two helps. Yes, please. Thank you. After this, if I can see, go it's back. Do I see other hands so that I can strategize? Yes. So I think I know you, and then we'll go to this side. Okay. Go ahead. I don't think so. Try again, pressing it. Isn't it working? Get another one.
Come up here.
Hey, you haven't come up. Yeah, just come in. But everybody won't be able to come. Another microphone, please, on this side, to the lady here.
Remember the panel. Okay.
Right.
I'm Joel Smith with Apt Associates in the U.S. So coming from America, I'm depressed already this week. Now I'm really depressed. I have a couple thoughts. One, I think caution, not every climate event is because of climate
Absolutely.
change. Okay. That's, there is an emerging field of attribution. I don't know if we want to get in there, but just be careful about saying everything is because of climate change, but it's climate, and that's important. But the other thought I have is this, why we're here in Marrakesh, it's about solutions, right? So we're being good at identifying the problems, and there are an enormous array of problems at different levels across the world. Some of this related to climate, some of it may be related to other causes, globalization and all that. And I'll also make the parenthetical comment, be careful about globalization and what happens, what people do when they're victims. We see this week. But I think we need to think hard about resilience and about how and I thought one of these presentations, in fact yours, I thought was very good, thinking about what do we do to improve the resilience of these communities. That's the challenge. And I do see a disconnect. So much of the focus in the UNFCCC is about money. So we have the GCF and the $100 billion pledge, which we do need the money, but that goes out. Where does it go? How do we ensure that it gets to the people that need it, when they need it, in a form that improves resilience? I think this is not something we're going to solve today, but I don't see enough discussion about this. Yep. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joel. Lady over there, can I have the microphone reach you? No. Then you might have to come in here. Can we not get microphones working? Yeah. Would you mind coming here? And Ashraf, sorry, you will be on oscillating. Yeah, do that. And then we'll go that way. Could the microphone be on this side now? Yeah, more than one if possible. Yep. All right, you go ahead, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Evgenia Mitrolio. I'm from ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability. And my question is adding up a little bit to what was said before about solutions. So the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, is asking for our input now on those non-economic losses. So I would like to ask the panelists, whoever wants to answer, based on your research or your work, what can we do about those non-economic losses? And because for the economic losses, we're asking for compensation, and that's good. But how can we compensate loss of dignity or loss of identity? How do you suggest we go forward? Because they are asking for our input.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent question. Hard one to answer. I think on this side there were hands and microphone on this side. Yep, please go ahead. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Musana Abu Mahmouda from Enda Energy. I'm based in Niger. I just want to ask a question related to the methodologies of in terms of evaluation of the losses and damage, especially the economics and the non-economics losses. I'm wondering whether are there any methodologies that are agreed in the framework of UNFCCC, or maybe these methodologies, do you think they are useful or not? I think as far as we do not have clear and agreed methodologies, sure, it may be also difficult to make the case of loss and damage in the UNFCCC level.
Very good.
The second question, please, is related the state of the negotiations on the issue of loss and damage here in Marrakech. I would really like to know more about that. Thank you.
You might have to have patience till the thing ends to know more about it. I'll come back to this side. Were there more hands? Yes, in front. Yeah, please. come to the gentleman here.
Thank you, Diego
Do I
Ramirez.
see any hands on this side? Oh, yeah, there is one. You got it. So then I'll come back to you. Go ahead, sir.
Diego Ramirez Lovering from Monash University. I was very interested in, very good presentations, by the way, very interested in the concept of maladaptation that you mentioned. And in particular, in thinking about what are the non-economic losses and how we value those, ultimately, identity, a very good one, cultural losses, etc., and how those might tip the scales to a maladaptation outcome or solution.
Yeah, thank you. We had, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I'm Kees van der Geest, United Nations University. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for putting this panel together, because I do agree with the first question asker that there's much focus on on the impacts and not so much on the solutions here. But I think there has not been enough on these elements of loss and damage. So I think it's really important that we put this in the spotlights. The question here is actually similar to the first two questions. Like, what are, if we know more about how loss and damage affects different kinds of people, what people value, and what are concrete next steps with that knowledge? It's a question I've also asked myself a lot of times with our own work on economic loss and damage.
Difficult struggle. I think the gentleman here, can he come here? Do I see any more hands? If not, maybe that's the last one. Then we'll come back this side.
I am Hassan Ibn Qasim. I am here in this conference for the COP22 with other colleagues representing indigenous peoples of Africa. I would like to ask you, as you know, the Paris Agreement is the first agreement which recognizes the rights for indigenous peoples and recognize the criteria in the United Nations Declaration on the Indigenous Peoples. In this, the preamble recognizes all rights and collective rights especially. But you know, these indigenous peoples were excluded for a long time. How your studies can benefit to indigenous peoples in this context?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. I think that's it. I'll come this side. I'll just make one comment on the indigenous people before we lose that one, because it's so vital. In the last World Congress on Conservation and Development in Honolulu 2 months ago, for the first time, indigenous people were considered a group to become member of the whole system of conservation and development. So there is a slightly more recognition than that. And one of the saddest part is the huge knowledge of the indigenous people that helps our biodiversity, our protection system, our impact on society, how people take it, what are the values, the spirituality, all that needs to be recognized, and we need to do that more. Without dwelling much on that, I'd request first to Petra to take 1 or 2 points, and again, be very short, but we'll try to address some of those. Some might get unaddressed. If you'd bear with us, we'll be available. Please talk to us, and then we'll take it from there, but we have to finish at 1 o'clock to hand over to others. So I'd request Petra. Are you waiting? Okay, take this one.
Well, thank you for the questions. Very briefly, the first question, are there methodologies that are agreed upon? The answer is no, not yet. I am part of the expert panel that supports Action Area 4 under the WUN. So again, NELS, non-economic losses. About 8 experts were invited to help address the first goal of the WUN and this action area, which is to increase the knowledge on how to assess and address NELs and the various tools we have. That process has only started, but it is on the agenda for the next year, meaning what are the methodologies, what are the approaches, are they complementary, are they not? It's unlikely that there will be one approach that will do all the tricks. It's a combination of approaches, but we should know what those are in a year, probably. What to do with that knowledge once we have it? I mean, there are a couple of suggestions, of course. Some of you think in terms of compensation, so compensation is one. We do have to keep in mind that it is inherently problematic to put a dollar value on something that cannot and should not have a dollar value. So for those who do push for compensation, keep in mind, what does it mean to preserve a graveyard? Is that worth $10, $100, $1 million? This is inherently problematic, and many indigenous people will refuse to think along those lines. But there are many other types of uses that I can think of. One, for example, is to really start reconsidering adaptation programs and start with what people really care about, what they value, what they want to protect. That's one, improve adaptation. A second one is to really reconsider governmental policies that affect people who are sticking it out in places that are highly exposed. Why is it that people deliberately stay in flood-prone areas? A governmental recommendation that is based on the best science assessments, and I can say that I was part of the IPCC, will say, relocation, you guys ought to move out there. Very often, this is not what people want. So understanding what people value, care about, want to defend, allows us to really fine-tune our governmental interventions so we can allow people to stay in places and defend them with the best possible adaptation options that we may not even know yet at this point.
Thank you, Petra. I go to Ghulam Rabbani. Very short answer. Pick up one or two, please. And then Mamun, and then you want to say something on that end? Any comment? No? Yes? Yes. Okay. Very short and very short.
Thank you very much. I think let me just address the question on what can be done. I mean, let me just tell you, think about a child could not go to school for 1 year because of cyclonic event. Why? Because the school was damaged. So you take a measure to protect the school, the infrastructure, so that the children can go to school immediately after the disaster. And I would say the second point is, if we try to maintain the commitment on adaptation, on mitigation, and address the loss and damage, at least we can, reduce some of the vulnerability. And that is why one of our leaders said, money is not a problem. If you have commitment, you can make things done. Thank you.
All right. You want to take it? Yeah.
I think the question of solutions is really important. As a participatory researcher and as someone who believes very strongly in the power of communities and in power being situated with communities, I will always argue that solutions should come from the communities, and that whether they're policy responses at a local or a national level, the power needs to be devolved down to communities, where communities can decide what they think is important and to inform the policies and actions from that space. A really interesting example is in the research around New Orleans. There were disaster response processes in place. There was a definition of family which defined family as heterosexual couples with children. As a result, families that had LGBTI parents were separated because they didn't meet that criteria and weren't given that support. And we actually had some situations of families being separated and displaced into different cities to respond to their needs in housing. This shows the importance of nuanced intersectional analyses of power in the way that policies and responses occur at the local level, where people are informing those policies.
Thank you. Mamun, you want to take it? And then over to that end, and 1 minute each, please.
I will just respond to the indigenous people, because one of the area that we studied, there were 700 households who are the Munda community, ethnic minority group. what we find out that one of the identity crises they are suffering, because their livelihood and something they live on is completely opposite to the major I think, population is the Bengali population. They do not like pigs and other things. So they are always left outside of any public facilities. And what we find out that because of this historical discrimination, many of the Munda whose religion is not Hindu now are creating themselves that we are no longer Munda, we are Hindu. Just think about that a whole community is trying to give up their ethnic identity and wants to adopt another name of the ethnicity because they are historically marginalized and marginalized, and by climate change, they cannot even continue the traditional types of livelihood. So now they are thinking to come out of this inequality and marginalization by renaming their ethnic groups as another religious identity. So this is really complex, and I personally find the question of the maladaptation is not simple. It is not economic, not social also, but the solution has to come. You cannot deal only with the non-economic value because the economic and non-economic is very, very interlinked. For example, when a woman tell me that if you come to my home, do not come with the sweet, because if you come with the sweet when you are coming to my home, this will require more drinking water for me. Rather, when you come to my home, come with the drinking water because that will help me as well as you. So think about the whole hospitality perception, the conception has changed. So if we cannot give them the solution of the water, which requires money, many of the other non-economic elements are tied with this thing. So we should not separate economic. This is my personal view. Economic and non-economic as a separate types of package. It has to be very integral. Importantly, our methodology, how we approach the programming when we do the loss and adaptation activities. And we need to be always vigilant about identifying and tracking the maladaptation in every our adaptation course. Yes, please. Go ahead. Sure.
All right, yeah, I'll be very quick. Yeah, I think I concur with Naomi in that finding solutions is very, very tricky. I found it particularly difficult to go through a literature review and try and understand how to apply what I've read within this context. I'm no expert, but what I can say is that from my study, I think it's critical that we consider inclusivity as well as capacity building within local adaptation plans in order to understand how, or in order to understand what people value from the local level. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't think anyone has the solution right now, but I think if we continue to have this dialogue, it will enhance how we understand loss and damage and what people value, most importantly. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone there? Thank you very much. I don't think we could do fair justice to all these very good questions and very involved questions. So we should continue the dialogue. That's the first point. Second point is on the solution. Everybody agrees there has to be solutions. Time and the scope of solution is not that easy or not that many, not that universal either. So you have to arrange and think of a solution specifically on the system itself. We have to have far deeper understanding of the system. The idea of leaving your own community and going somewhere else, not always easy, because most often we have done our research with communities across many countries. Nobody wants to leave their home. That is one of the first learning. And so migration by definition is a forced displacement issue. And it is one of those tragedies one leaves behind, their history, their culture, and all that. I can tell you many more stories on that. So we will, on the question of what type of solution, well, that solution has to be integrated to the development paradigm of those people themselves, the communities, the ecosystems. It cannot be an isolated, separate climate solution only. Climate is an integral part of the our future sustainable development paradigm. So I would say, let's remember, out of the 17 SDGs, climate is number 13, one of them, and let's try and work together on that as matters of solution. There may not be simple outside, climate solution, but there needs to be development solutions. So integration is vitally important. As to the value of economic loss, non-economic loss, at the risk of being flippant, let me say, what is the price of a sunset? How are you going to cost it? Who are going to? It's a very difficult one. In the world of Donald Trump, definitely he will find it useless, a sunset, because it doesn't bring money for him. So it won't be very good. But that is not how the rest of the world would think, I think. So the value and the valuation is a very personal, integrated, innate. It goes beyond the economic loss. It is a much more spiritual, much more social integration is part of the community values, which is a much more difficult thing to assess. But nonetheless, one has to, for the sake of management and attribution not in the sense of who should get the money, but what causes that problem, because we might, climate change, there are other climate issues, as Joel had said, we must not attribute everything to climate change. We must be cautious, get the science right, and that science is rigorous. It takes time. Methodologies are rigorous issues, does take time. But at the same time, we are running against time, and that is what we have to harmonize. It is an uphill channel. We are delighted that you have been here. Our time is exactly 1 o'clock, 1 minute to 1. So we have done reasonably well from our side. Thanks for your patience and being here. Let's continue this discussion in this forum, in other fora that goes on in this area. I'm sure I've seen many negotiators here who will take this message to their own members. And we look forward to continue the discussion ourselves between us and you and everybody else. That's where the future is. We are, remember, like many other communities under threat, we are a community of, loss and damage. We are not under so much threat, but we have to open the opportunities for taking this issue further for the future generations to come. Thank you very much. Thanks for your participation.
Yes. Hello. All of them.
Hello. Hi.
Okay. Yeah. Can you wait for a moment for people who have questions? I'll have yours here. Hello. Wonderful. Yep. It's on the net. It's on the site. If you go to the site event website, the white paper is in there. And same slide I showed. What to send to us. My information is in there. Please do. That would be fantastic. Fantastic. Hello. Yes. If you go onto the site event website,